At 1:52 in the morning, Rafael Duarte's car rolled through the iron gates of his own estate and stopped, because his headlights had caught something they were never supposed to catch: a woman, sitting on the cold stone steps of his mansion, a sleeping child wrapped inside her coat, snow gathering in her hair, like she had been sitting there long enough to become part of the architecture. No one came near this house uninvited. No one. The last man who tried to walk up that driveway without permission had not walked back down it. And yet, here she was, not hiding, not running, just sitting, with her arms locked around a boy who could not have been older than 5, her body curved over him like a roof, like she had decided that if the cold was going to take someone tonight, it would take her first. Rafael sat in the car for a long moment, watching her through the windshield, the way he studied everything, for the lie in it, for the weapon in it, for the reason a person does something that makes no sense. She wasn't a spy. Spies didn't fall asleep sitting up with a child in their arms. She wasn't an assassin. Assassins didn't have holes in the soles of their shoes. She was just a woman who had run out of places to go, and had picked, of all the doors in the city, the one door that terrified everyone else. He stepped out of the car. 2 of his men moved toward her immediately, hands already inside their jackets, and Rafael lifted one finger, a small motion, the kind that had once made a man drop to his knees begging, and both of them stopped like they'd hit glass. He walked up the steps alone. She woke the second his shadow touched her, and she did something that no one had done in front of him in over a decade. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She looked up at him, this stranger in a black coat, framed by 2 armed men and a mansion the size of a hotel, and she pulled her son tighter against her chest and said in a voice that shook from cold, but not from fear, "If you're going to hurt him, you'll have to go through me first." Rafael Duarte, a man 3 different governments had tried and failed to indict, a man whose name made grown men change the subject in restaurants, stood on his own front steps and found that he did not know what to say to that. Her name was Josephine Hale. She would tell him that much, eventually, though not that first night. That first night she gave him almost nothing. Not her name, not where she'd come from, not why a woman with a child was sleeping outside a stranger's gate in the middle of a February storm, instead of a homeless shelter, a hotel, a friend's couch, anywhere that made sense. "Get up," Rafael said, not gently. He didn't know how to be gently. Gentleness was a language he had let atrophy the way a man lets a native tongue fade after enough years abroad. "You'll freeze out here." "We're fine," Josephine said, which was such an obvious lie that even the boy, half asleep against her shoulder, opened his eyes and looked at her like even he knew better. "You're not fine. You're gray." Rafael crouched, which put him at her eye level for the first time, and something in her expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, that a man like him crouched for anyone. "I'm not asking a second time."
"And I don't take charity," she said. And there it was, the thing that would define the next 6 months of both their lives, delivered in a whisper through chattering teeth, from a woman who had nothing, to a man who owned 3 city blocks and a small piece of the local government.
Before we go any further, please like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know what city you're watching from in the comments. All right, let's continue.
Not from anyone, especially not from someone who needs 2 bodyguards to answer his own door. One of the men behind Rafael made a sound like he'd swallowed wrong. No one spoke to Rafael Duarte like that. No one alive. Rafael looked at her for a long 3 seconds. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the ghost of the idea of one. "Then you can work for it," he said. "I need someone to run my kitchen. The last woman quit because she said the house was haunted." He stood, offering nothing else, no hand, no help, because instinct told him she'd refuse it anyway. "You start tomorrow. Tonight you sleep inside, because if you die on my property, I'll have to deal with the paperwork, and I hate paperwork." It was the closest thing to a joke he had made in 4 years. Josephine didn't laugh, but she stood, gathered her sleeping son into her arms with the kind of practiced strength that told Rafael she'd done this 1,000 times before, picked him up, carried him somewhere safer, made herself smaller so he could be bigger, and walked up the last 3 steps into the house without looking back to see if she was allowed. She wasn't asking permission. She had decided. Rafael watched her go and thought, with the distant, clinical part of his mind that noticed things other men missed, "She's terrified, and she is not going to let a single person in this house see it." He didn't yet know how much that observation would cost him. By the second week, the household had reorganized itself around Josephine Hale the way water reorganizes itself around a stone dropped into a still pond, quietly but completely. The staff, who had spent years perfecting the art of moving through the mansion like ghosts, afraid to make noise, afraid to be noticed, afraid of a boss who spoke in short sentences and never explained himself, found themselves laughing in the kitchen for the first time in memory. Josephine did not tiptoe. She did not whisper. She sang under her breath while she cooked, off-key and unbothered. And when Marco, one of Raphael's men, made the mistake of telling her to keep it down because Mr. Duarte doesn't like noise, she looked him dead in the eye and said, "Mr. Duarte doesn't own my voice. He owns this house. There's a difference," and gone right on singing. Word of that exchange reached Raphael by dinner. He said nothing, but he ate in the kitchen that night instead of the dining room, for the first time in years, and told no one why. The truth was simpler than anyone in that house would have guessed, and more dangerous. Rafael Duarte had built his entire life on the principle that softness gets people killed. His father had been soft, once, in a different life, in a different country, and softness had cost him everything. His business, his wife, eventually his life, bleeding out on the floor of a warehouse while 8-year-old Raphael hid behind a stack of crates and learned in real time the lesson that would define him. The world does not spare gentlemen.
So Raphael had made himself into something the world couldn't hurt: gold, precise, unreachable. He had not pried in 23 years. He had not trusted anyone outside his 3 most senior men in almost as long. He had built walls so high around himself that even he sometimes forgot there was a person living inside them. He remembered his father's last words with a clarity that had never once dulled with time. Not a warning, not an apology, just his father's hand, slick with blood, closing weakly around 8-year-old Raphael's wrist, and a single whispered instruction: "Don't let them see what you love. It's the only thing they can use against you." Raphael had taken that lesson and built an entire life out of it, brick by careful brick, until loving nothing had become indistinguishable from surviving everything. He had told himself for 23 years that this made him strong. It had taken a stranger sitting on his front steps to make him wonder for the first time whether it had only ever made him alone. And then a woman with a broken shoe and a sleeping child had looked up at him from his own front steps and refused to be afraid of him. And something in the foundation of those walls had shifted half an inch, just half an inch, enough to notice, not enough to worry about.
He told himself that anyway. The boy's name was Sam. He was 4 years old, quiet in the particular way children get quiet when they've learned that quiet keeps them safe. And it took him exactly 9 days to stop flinching every time a door closed too loud. It was Sam, not Josephine, who broke through first. Raphael found him in the east hallway on a Tuesday afternoon, small hands pressed to the glass of a display case that held, among other things, a chess set carved from black and white marble that had belonged to Raphael's grandfather. "You play?" Raphael asked, because it seemed rude to say nothing to a child staring at his things with such open wonder, and rudeness to children was a line even Rafael Duarte hadn't crossed. Sam looked up at him with the wide, unguarded eyes only small children have left, eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide anything. "Mommy says we can't touch things that aren't ours. It's a rule I like, but I'm making an exception." He opened the case, lifted out the board, and set it on the low table by the window. "Sit." He taught Sam how the knight moved, the strange sideways hop that confuses every beginner, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he was smiling. Actually smiling. The real kind. The kind that reaches the eyes. For the first time since, he genuinely could not remember since when.
Josephine found them there 20 minutes later and stopped in the doorway so abruptly that she nearly dropped the laundry basket in her arms. The most feared man in the city was sitting cross-legged on his own Persian rug, patiently explaining to a 4-year-old why the bishop only moves diagonally, and something about the sight of it made her chest hurt in a way she didn't have a name for yet. "Josephine, time for your nap," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. "But Mr. Raphael is teaching me chess," Sam protested. "Mr. Raphael has work to do," Josephine said, looking at Raphael over her son's head, a silent apology in her eyes. "I'm sorry, he's not usually like this. I'm sorry he's bothering you." And Raphael surprised them both by shaking his head. "He's not bothering me," Raphael said, and meant it, and hated a little bit how much he meant it. "We'll finish the game tomorrow." Sam beamed like Raphael had promised him the moon and ran off toward the stairs, and for a moment it was just the two of them standing in the long afternoon light of the east hallway, Josephine holding a laundry basket like a shield, Raphael still sitting on the floor like the events of the last 20 minutes hadn't fully caught up with him yet. "You didn't have to do that," Josephine said quietly. "I know. He gets attached fast. It's not fair to him if—" She stopped herself. "If what?" "If this isn't going to last," she finished, and there was something old and tired in the way she said it, something that told Raphael this wasn't the first time she'd had to explain to her son why something good wasn't going to stay. Raphael stood, brushing off his slacks, and for once in his life said something without calculating at first. "Nothing has to end just because you're used to things ending." Josephine looked at him for a long moment, like she was trying to decide whether that sentence was a kindness or a trap. She left without answering, but that night, for the first time since she'd arrived, Raphael heard singing drift up through the kitchen vents while he worked in his study 3 floors above, and he found he couldn't concentrate on the ledger in front of him at all. Here is what nobody in that house knew yet, not even Josephine. Rafael Duarte had not found her by accident. 6 years earlier, in a different city, in a different life, a man named Walter Hale had done something no one else in the organization would do. He had walked into a burning building, not metaphorically, an actual building, actually on fire, set alight by a rival family trying to eliminate a 19-year-old Raphael before he could inherit anything worth inheriting, and pulled him out through a service door 2 minutes before the roof came down. Walter Hale had asked for nothing in return. He'd driven away before Raphael even learned his name. It had taken Raphael 4 years of careful, quiet searching to learn who his rescuer was. It had taken 2 more to learn that Walter Hale had died of a heart attack in his own garage, leaving behind a wife who divorced him 3 years before that and a daughter he hadn't spoken to in almost as long. It had taken 6 months of watching, from a careful and respectful distance, to understand that the daughter, Josephine, was drowning, an ex-husband who'd left her with debts instead of support, a landlord who evicted her the week after Christmas, a system that kept telling her she made too much to qualify for help and too little to actually survive.
Raphael could have simply written a check. He was rich enough that the amount wouldn't have registered as a rounding error. But he understood, in a way most men in his position never bothered to, that charity handed down from a stranger humiliates as often as it helps, and he suspected, correctly, that a woman like Josephine's Hale would burn a check before she'd cash one from a man she'd never met. So instead, he had done something colder, and in its own way kinder. He had quietly arranged for every safe option to close. The apartment she'd almost gotten fell through. The job interview got mysteriously canceled, not out of cruelty. Raphael told himself this again and again, though even he wasn't fully sure he believed it, but because he needed her to end up somewhere he could actually help her without her ever knowing his hand was in it. Somewhere she'd choose to stay because staying made sense, not because she owed him anything. He hadn't expected her to end up on his front steps in a snowstorm with her son in her arms. That part, the part that made his chest tighten every time he thought about it, the part where his calculated, careful plan had nearly gotten a child frozen to death on his property, that part he had not accounted for, and it haunted him more than he let himself admit. He hadn't told her any of this.
He told himself it was because the timing wasn't right. The truth was he was afraid of what her face would do when she found out. 3 weeks in, the first crack in Josephine's armor appeared, and it appeared because of a nightmare. Raphael heard it from the hallway, a muffled cry through her closed door, sharp and startled, followed by silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone trying very hard to cry without making noise. He stood outside that door longer than he'd ever admit to anyone. Every instinct in him said, "Walk away. This isn't your business. You don't do this. You've never done this." But his feet didn't move.
He knocked, softly. "Josephine." Silence. Then, "I'm fine. Go back to bed." "You're not fine. I can hear you not being fine through a door." Another silence. Longer this time, and then the lock clicked and the door opened 3 inches, and Josephine's face appeared in the gap. Eyes red-rimmed, hair loose around her shoulders in a way he'd never seen it, always tied back, always practical, always armored. Now it just hung there, soft, human, and it did something to Raphael's chest that he didn't have a word for. "It's stupid," she said. "It's just a dream." What was it about? She hesitated so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "My ex-husband, Marcus. He used to say that no man would ever want a woman with a kid who came with this much baggage. I know it's not true. I know I'm not—" She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I know I did nothing wrong leaving him. But some nights he's still in my head telling me I'm worthless, and I hate that he still gets to do that from 3 states away." Raphael did not know what he was supposed to say to this. He hadn't comforted anyone in over 2 decades. The closest he came to consoling anyone was making sure the people who hurt them never got the chance again. So he said the only true thing he had. "He's wrong. You don't know him. I don't need to. Any man who tells a woman she's baggage instead of understanding that she's carrying something heavy alone and still standing, that man deserves the air he wastes talking." Raphael's voice had gone low, edged with something that wasn't quite anger but lived in the same neighborhood. "You walked up to my front gate in a snowstorm and threatened to fight me for your son's safety. That is not a woman with baggage, Josephine. That is a woman who could burn down half this city if she decided it needed burning."
Josephine stared at him. Something in her face cracked open, just slightly, just enough, and then unexpectedly she laughed. A real laugh, wet with leftover tears, surprised out of her. "That might be the strangest compliment anyone has ever given me. I'm not known for my bedside manner." "No," she agreed, still half smiling. "You're really not." They stood there a moment too long, the door open 3 inches between them, something unspoken passing back and forth in the quiet hallway. Then Josephine said, softly, "Thank you for not pretending it was nothing." "I don't pretend. It's a waste of time." She closed the door gently this time, not the sharp defensive click from before, and Raphael walked back to his own room with his pulse doing something strange and unfamiliar in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study instead, staring at a photograph he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk, a photograph of a man he'd spent 10 years searching for, a man with kind eyes and Josephine's exact same stubborn jaw, and wondered, for the first time at all, whether he had any right at all to what he was starting to feel for this man's daughter. The first real threat arrived on Thursday, wrapped in an ordinary envelope, delivered by an ordinary courier, which was exactly how the worst threats always arrived in Raphael's world. Inside was a single photograph, Josephine walking Sam to the small private school Raphael had quietly enrolled him in 3 weeks earlier, taken from a car parked across the street. On the back, in handwriting Raphael recognized instantly and felt in his stomach like a dropped stone, 3 words, "Found her, Rafa." The handwriting belonged to Emilio, once Raphael's closest lieutenant, the man he'd trusted with his life for 6 years, until 18 months ago when Emilio had tried to have him killed in a bid to take over the organization.
The attempt had failed. Emilio had fled south of the border with a fraction of Raphael's territory and a much larger portion of his rage. Raphael had assumed Emilio wouldn't resurface for years. He had not accounted for the possibility that Emilio might find Josephine before Raphael found him. He called his head of security, Diego, into his study within the hour, and for the first time since Josephine's arrival, the version of Raphael that had built an empire out of fear resurfaced fully, cold-eyed, precise, terrifying in a way none of the household staff had witnessed yet. Triple the perimeter. No one enters or leaves without clearance, and find out how he knows she's here, because I did not make that mistake, which means someone in this house did. You think we have a leak? I know we have a leak, Raphael said, and the quiet certainty in his voice was worse than shouting would have been. I want to know who before I decide what to do about it. He didn't tell Josephine any of this that night. He told himself it was to protect her. It was, in fact, the first lie he told her, a lie of omission, but a lie all the same, and it would very nearly cost him everything. Josephine noticed the change immediately, because noticing was a survival skill she'd spent years perfecting. More guards, longer hours, Raphael eating dinner alone in his study instead of the kitchen, a habit he'd only just broken, now reinstated overnight, without explanation.
She confronted him on the 5th day, cornering him in the study with the particular directness that had, against every instinct Raphael possessed, become one of his favorite things about her. "Something's wrong," she said. "Not a question. Nothing you need to worry about. Don't do that." Her voice sharpened, and Raphael watched something flare behind her eyes, not fear, but fury. The specific fury of a woman who has spent her whole life being told what she doesn't need to worry about right before the things she wasn't warned about knocked her flat. I have spent my entire life with people deciding what I'm strong enough to handle without asking me. I left a husband who did that. I am not doing it again, especially not with the man whose house my son sleeps in every night. Raphael set down his pen, looked at her fully for the first time since she'd walked in, and made a decision that later he would recognize as the moment everything between them changed irreversibly. "Sit down," he said. "I'll tell you everything." He told her about Emilio, about the coup attempt 18 months ago, about the photograph, the handwriting, the threat wrapped in 3 words on the back of a picture of her son walking to school. He told her because at this point there was no version of the truth that made sense without it. About her father. Josephine went very still. "What did you just say?" "Your father saved my life 14 years ago. A building fire, a rival family trying to eliminate me before I could take over my father's business. He pulled me out and left before I could even thank him." Raphael's voice had gone quiet, stripped of his usual armor. "It took me years to find out who he was, longer to find out what happened to you after he died. I didn't bring you into this house by accident, Josephine. I've been watching over you from a distance for longer than you know."
The silence that followed was the worst thing Raphael had experienced in years, worse than gunfire, worse than the moment as a child when he'd watched his father bleed out on a warehouse floor. Josephine's face moved through disbelief, then confusion, then something that looked horribly like betrayal. "Watching over me," she repeated slowly. "You mean you were involved in what happened to my apartment, my job interview, everything that fell apart right before I ended up on your doorstep?" Raphael did not deny it, because he had promised himself, sitting in this study on the night of her nightmare, that he would not lie to her again. "Yes," he said. Josephine stood up so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. "You manipulated my entire life so that I would end up dependent on you. That's not, isn't it?" Her voice cracked, and for the first time she'd ever known him, Rafael Duarte looked genuinely, completely lost. "I have spent every day since I got here so proud of myself. I told myself I earned my place in this house. I told myself I wasn't just another woman who needed rescuing. And you're telling me that was never even true? You built the trap and then congratulated me for walking into it?" I never wanted you dependent on me, Raphael said, and his voice, for the first time she'd ever heard it, shook. I wanted you safe. There's a difference. Not to me, there isn't, Josephine said, and walked out of the study before he could say another word, leaving Rafael Duarte alone with the photograph in his desk drawer and the sick, sinking understanding that he had made the exact mistake his father had made, trying to protect someone by controlling the truth around them, and it had blown up in his hands exactly the way it always did.
She didn't leave that night. She couldn't. Not with Emilio Cruz somewhere in the city with a photograph of her son. But something between them had gone cold and formal, and for the next 4 days, Josephine spoke to Raphael only when necessary, moved through the house like a guest instead of the woman who'd once sung off-key in his kitchen, and Raphael found the silence unbearable in a way he had never expected silence to be. It was Sam, again, who cracked things open. Sam, who did not understand adult betrayals, who only understood that Mr. Raphael hadn't finished their chess game in almost a week. "Is Mommy mad at you?" Sam asked one evening, perched on the arm of the study chair while Raphael stared blankly at paperwork he hadn't actually read a single line of. "Yes," Raphael said, because lying to this particular child felt like a line he genuinely could not cross. "Did you do something bad?" Raphael considered the question with more seriousness than it probably deserved. "I did something I thought was right. It turned out to be more complicated than that." Sam nodded solemnly, the way children do when they're pretending to understand something far above their heads. "Mommy says complicated things need saying sorry even if you didn't mean to mess up. She says sorry isn't about being right, it's about the other person's feelings." Out of the mouths of 4-year-olds. Raphael looked at this small, serious boy passing along his mother's wisdom like scripture, and felt something in his chest crack open in a way it hadn't in 23 years. He found Josephine in the garden an hour later, arms crossed against the evening chill, staring at nothing in particular. "I owe you an apology," Raphael said, without preamble, because he'd learned by now that Josephine had no patience for men who circled things. Not for finding you, not for wanting to protect you, but for deciding, on my own, that you didn't deserve to know the truth while I did it. You're right. I took your choices away from you the same way your husband did, just with better manners and a bigger house. He let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest for days. I'm not used to caring about someone's feelings before I act. I've spent my whole life caring about outcomes. You're the first person in a long time who's made me realize those aren't the same thing. Josephine turned to look at him, arms still crossed, guarded but listening. "My father," she said, finally, quietly. "Tell me about him. The real him, not the hero in a Fire version. I want to know who he was before he stopped being my dad." And so, standing in the cold garden as the sun went down, Raphael told her about the man who'd pulled him from a burning building and asked for nothing, about the search that had taken years, about the quiet grief of learning that his rescuer had died alone, estranged from the daughter he clearly still loved enough to sacrifice everything protecting a stranger's son. Josephine cried finally, openly, the kind of crying that had clearly been owed for years and never collected on, and Raphael did something he had not done for another human being since he was a child. He held her, not a calculated gesture, not a strategic comfort. He simply opened his arms, and she stepped into them, and they stood together in the dark while the first real trust either of them had extended in years passed silently between them. "I'm still angry," Josephine murmured into his shoulder.
"Is that so?" Josephine crossed the room slowly, and Raphael stood, and the space between them shrank until there was almost none left at all. "I don't know how to do this," Raphael admitted, low, almost a confession. "I haven't let myself want anything this much in 20 years. I don't know if I'm capable of doing it right." "Nobody does it right," Josephine said softly. "You just do it honestly. That's the only part that actually matters." He kissed her then, careful at first, like he was afraid she might vanish, and then not careful at all, and somewhere in the kitchen below, dinner burned completely unnoticed, and neither one of them cared even slightly. For one golden week, it seemed like the story might simply be allowed to be happy.
It was not going to be allowed to be happy for very much longer. Happiness, in stories like this one, is never allowed to sit quietly for long. It has to be tested. And the test arrived, as these things so often do, wearing an expensive dress and a practiced smile. Her name was Valentina Rios, and she arrived at the estate on a bright Thursday morning with 2 bodyguards, a driver, and the particular confidence of a woman who had been raised to believe a certain future belonged to her by right. Valentina's mother, before her death, had spent years quietly cultivating a friendship with the Rios family. Old money, old alliances, the kind of connection that made merger and marriage nearly interchangeable words in Raphael's world. Valentina had grown up half expecting that one day she and Raphael would be married, not out of love, but out of the tidy practical logic that ran their circles. 2 powerful families combined into one unbreakable one. She did not know about Josephine, or rather she knew but had decided, the way people in their position often decide, that whatever was happening in that kitchen was a passing indulgence, not a threat.
Raphael. Valentina swept into the study like she already owned it, kissing both his cheeks before he could so much as stand. You've been impossible to reach. I had to hear from your uncle that you'd been shot. Shot, Raphael. And you didn't think to call me? I was recovering, Raphael said evenly, already sensing the shape of the conversation coming and dreading it. Recovering, yes, I heard about that too. Valentina's eyes flicked deliberately toward the doorway where Josephine had just appeared with a tray of coffee, only to stop cold at the sight of the 2 of them together. The housekeeper who nursed you back to health. How very charming, very Florence Nightingale. The word housekeeper landed exactly where it was aimed. Josephine's spine straightened, but she said nothing, only set the tray down with more precision than necessary and turned to leave. Josephine, Raphael said, an edge of warning in his voice, though whether the warning was for Valentina or a plea for Josephine to stay, even he wasn't entirely sure. I have work to do, Josephine said, and the coolness in her voice was new, was armor going back up after months of being allowed to stay down, and Raphael watched her go with a feeling like watching sand slip through his fingers. Raphael said nothing, because the terrible truth was that a small, frightened part of him, the same part that had built 23 years of walls out of a single warehouse fire, agreed with every word and hated himself for it. Josephine did not confront him that night. She didn't need to say anything at all. The silence between them said it for her, stretching cold and careful across the dinner table, across the hallway, across the space in the bed where for the first time in weeks she turned her back to him instead of curling into his shoulder. It was 2 days before the wound actually opened. She found him in the study late that second night, staring at nothing, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating rings on his desk, and something about the sight of him, brooding, distant, exactly like the cold stranger who'd first crouched in front of her on his own icy steps, made all the careful patience she'd been holding finally snap. "Say it," she said from the doorway. Raphael looked up, startled out of whatever dark loop his thoughts had been running. "Say what? Whatever she said to you, whatever's been eating you alive for 2 days, say it to my face instead of letting it rot between us." He was quiet for a long moment, and then, because he had promised her no more secrets, he told her every ugly word Valentina had said, and worse, the fear underneath it, the fear he hadn't even admitted to himself yet. She said this life eats gentle people alive, that you don't know how to disappear fast enough if someone comes for me, that I'm the reason you and Sam are in danger at all, and that loving you doesn't make that any less true.
"And you believe her," Josephine said. "It wasn't a question. I believe I put a bullet in my own shoulder trying to keep you both alive, and I still don't know if it's enough," Raphael said, and his voice cracked in a way she'd only heard once before, on that first night by her bedroom door. "I've spent my whole life making sure nothing soft could be used against me, And now the two people I would burn this entire empire to the ground for are exactly that. Soft, breakable, because of me. Do you know what's actually breakable, Raphael? Josephine's voice shook, but she didn't back down, didn't soften the way he might have expected. A woman who spends her whole life being told she's a liability, who gets left by a husband who called her baggage, who gets looked at by a woman in silk like she's something that needs to be swept out of the way. I have survived being treated as fragile my entire life. I did not survive it by actually being fragile. I survived it by refusing to let anyone else decide what I can carry. She crossed the room, stood in front of him, forced him to meet her eyes. You don't get to protect me by deciding, quietly, in this study, that I'm too breakable to stay. That's the same thing you did with my apartment and my job interview. You are doing it again, right now, and I need you to hear yourself doing it. The silence after that landed heavy and true, and Raphael, staring up at her, furious, magnificent, refusing every inch of ground Valentina had tried to claim on her behalf, felt the last of his fear crack apart under the weight of something far stronger. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it completely. You're right. I let 2 days of someone else's fear nearly undo 6 months of you proving every single day exactly how strong you are. That won't happen again. It had better not, Josephine said, though the edge in her voice had already begun to soften, because I didn't fall in love with a man who needed someone else's permission to believe in me. Raphael stood, closed the distance between them, and this time there was no hesitation in the way he reached for her. Valentina will not be welcome in his house again. Not because you asked, because I finally understand what I almost let her talk me out of. He pressed his forehead to hers, the same gesture from the bloodied living room floor months earlier, now carrying an entirely different weight. You are not a liability, Josephine Hale. You are the only thing in 23 years that's made me want to survive for a reason other than winning. It should have ended there, that quiet reconciliation in the study, but the story was not finished testing them yet, because Valentina Rios did not take rejection quietly, and the phone call she made the following morning, to a man she knew only as an old family contact with grudges of his own against Rafael Duarte, would put everything Josephine had just fought to protect back into terrible danger. She did not know when she made that call that the man on the other end was Emilio Cruz. The betrayal, when it came from somewhere neither of them expected. Diego, Rafael's head of security, a man Rafael had trusted for 11 years, a man who had personally sworn to protect this house, had been the leak all along. Not through malice, through debt. Emilio had found Diego's younger brother, drowning in gambling debts to a rival organization, and had offered a simple trade, information for the debt's erasure. Diego had told himself it was harmless, a photograph, an address confirmation, nothing that would actually endanger anyone. What Diego hadn't known was that Emilio had spent weeks with only fragments, a location, half a routine, nothing precise enough to act on. It was Valentina's phone call, 3 days earlier, made in a fit of wounded pride she would spend the rest of her life regretting, that had handed him the final piece. The exact day security rotation thinned, and the fact that Raphael's guard always dropped on Sundays. She hadn't meant for anyone to get hurt. She had told herself, the way people always tell themselves, that she only wanted to scare Josephine off, to remind everyone whose world this was supposed to be. She had not accounted for what a man like Emilio Cruz would do with an opening that precise. Diego had been catastrophically wrong about the size of the danger he'd let through the gate. Valentina had been just as wrong about what her wounded pride would cost. It happened on a Sunday, when the household's guard was down in the particular way households let their guard down on Sundays. Fewer men on rotation, everyone a little softer, Sam building a blanket fort in the living room while Josephine read on the couch, and Raphael, astonishingly, sat cross-legged on the floor helping architect the fort's structural integrity like it was the single most important task he'd ever undertaken. The first sign of trouble was the sound of the front gate's alarm failing to sound at all, because Diego, under threat to his brother's life, had disabled it 20 minutes earlier. 3 of Emilio's men were in the house before anyone realized the silence was wrong. What happened next took less than 4 minutes, though it would feel in Josephine's memory forever after like it lasted an hour. Shouting, the specific gut-emptying sound of Sam screaming her name, Raphael moving faster than she had ever seen a person move, putting himself bodily between the intruders and her son, and the sharp, terrible crack of gunfire inside a house that had, until 4 minutes ago, smelled like blanket forts and burnt dinner and the beginning of something good. Raphael took the bullet meant for Josephine.
It entered his shoulder, not his chest. Later, everyone would agree this was the difference between a very bad night and a funeral. But in the moment, watching him fall against the doorframe with blood already spreading dark across his white shirt, Josephine did not know that. She only knew the man she had let herself love, against every instinct built over a lifetime of learning not to, was on the ground in front of her, and her son was screaming, and the world had narrowed down to a single unbearable point. Raphael! His own men arrived seconds later, Raphael's actual loyal men, alerted by the gunfire, and the fight that followed was brief and brutal, and ended with 2 of Emilio's men dead, and 1, wounded and disarmed, dragged away for questioning that would reveal within the hour Diego's betrayal and the full shape of what Emilio had planned. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was Josephine on her knees on her own blood-slicked floor, hands pressed hard against Raphael's shoulder, saying his name over and over like an incantation that might keep him conscious through sheer repetition. "Stay with me," she said, voice breaking apart. "Stay with me. Do you hear me? You don't get to do this. You don't get to almost die for me and then actually die. That's not how this works." Josephine. Raphael's voice was thin, but his eyes found hers and held. "Sam, is Sam? He's fine. He's safe. Diego got him out of the room the second it started. He's fine. Don't you dare worry about him right now. Worry about staying alive." "I'm not going anywhere," Raphael said. And even bleeding on his own living room floor, there was something in his voice that sounded almost like amusement, almost like the ghost of the dry, quiet humor she'd fallen in love with. "I own the ambulance company. They'll be quick."
She laughed, wet and horrified and helpless, and pressed her forehead briefly to his, and it was the most honest moment either of them had shared yet. More honest than the kiss, more honest than the garden, because there was nothing left to perform, nothing left to protect. Just 2 people who had, against every reasonable expectation, found something worth almost dying for. He survived, of course. This was a love story, and love stories understand the rules even when the characters living inside them don't. But surviving the bullet turned out to be the easy part. The next morning, while Raphael lay recovering under armed guard in a private wing of the house he owned partial stakes in, Josephine sat beside his bed, exhausted, wrung out, and finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been building since Emilio Cruz's men walked into her son's blanket fort. "Is this ever going to stop?" she asked quietly. "The threats, the enemies, the men who show up wanting to hurt the people you love because of things that happened before I even knew you?" Raphael, pale against the pillows, his shoulder bandaged and his voice still weak from blood loss, did not lie to her because he had promised he never would again. "I don't know," he admitted. "This life doesn't come with garantias, Josephine. I built an empire out of fear, and fear has a way of returning to collect what it's owed. I can't promise you it will always be safe." "Then what can you promise me?" He reached for her hand, slow with pain, and held it like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "That I will spend every day making sure the danger touches me before it ever touches you or Sam again. That I will never lie to you about what's coming, even when the truth is ugly. And that whatever this is between us, I am not letting it go because it's complicated. I've spent my whole life protecting myself by refusing to want anything. You and Sam are the first things I've wanted enough to be afraid of losing. I'm not walking away from that just because it's dangerous. I'm choosing it anyway." Josephine's eyes filled, and this time she let the tears fall without hiding them, without apologizing for them, without the armor she'd carried since the night she first sat frozen on his front steps. "I didn't come here looking for a mafia boss to fall in love with," she said, half laughing, half crying. "I came here looking for somewhere warm to sleep." "I didn't go looking for you at all. Raphael said, your father found me first. I think in a strange way he's been taking care of me since that fire, and now I get to take care of what he left behind." That's either the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me or deeply unsettling. I genuinely can't decide which. "Both," Raphael said, and for the first time in the entire story, he smiled, a real, full, unguarded smile, and it changed his whole face into something Josephine understood with sudden and total clarity she would spend the rest of her life trying to earn again and again.
Emilio Cruz was found 6 days later in a warehouse 2 hours outside the city by men loyal to Rafael, who had spent every one of those 6 days combing the region without sleep. What happened in that warehouse is not part of this story. Some things are better left to the reader's imagination, and Rafael Duarte was not, in the end, a man interested in mercy towards those who threatened his family. Diego, for his part, was not killed. Rafael, changed in ways he himself didn't fully understand yet, chose instead to pay off the brother's debt himself and send Diego away with the clear understanding that his life had been spared exactly once and would not be spared twice. It was, in its own way, the most merciful thing anyone had ever seen Rafael Duarte do, and it was entirely because of the woman currently teaching his cook staff how to make her grandmother's cornbread in his kitchen. The truth about Valentina's phone call surfaced during the questioning of Emilio's surviving man, and Rafael carried that piece of information for 3 full days before he decided what to do with it. He did not send men to her door. He did not, as the old version of himself certainly would have, treat wounded pride as something requiring blood in return. Instead, he called her himself once and told her in a voice she would remember for the rest of her life that the Duarte and Rios families were finished. Not through violence, but through the much quieter, much more permanent language of business. Contracts unrenewed, doors closed, a reputation built over generations allowed to simply wither on its own for lack of anyone willing to protect it. It was, in its own way, a mercy too. Valentina did not go to prison. She simply stopped mattering to the only world she had ever been raised to belong to, and had to learn the hard way and too late what it felt like to be the one standing outside a gate with nowhere left to go. Josephine, when Rafael told her all of it, said only one thing: "I almost feel sorry for her." Then, after a pause, with the faintest wicked trace of a smile, "Almost." The rest of the story unfolds gently, the way the best endings do, not with fireworks, but with quiet, accumulated proof that the hardest parts were finally, truly over. 6 months after the night she first sat on his front steps, Josephine Hale stood in the same garden where Rafael had first held her, wearing a simple ivory dress, with Sam standing solemnly beside her in a small suit he insisted made him look like a boss, holding a ring pillow with the kind of ceremonial gravity only a 5-year-old can bring to the task. Raphael waited at the end of the garden path, and when Josephine appeared, something in his face, the same face that had once made grown men change the subject in restaurants, undid itself, completely, openly, in front of every guest present. "You once told me nothing has to end just because I'm used to things ending," Josephine said when it was her turn to speak, her voice steady despite the tears already gathering. "I didn't believe you. I'd spent so long being ready for the next disappointment that I didn't know how to trust something good was allowed to just stay. But you stayed. Through Emilio, through the bullet, through every ugly truth we handed each other instead of hiding it. You taught my son to play chess and taught me that being protected doesn't mean being small. I came to your gate with nowhere left to go. I'm not leaving this garden as a woman who needed rescuing. I'm leaving it as a woman who chose you, completely, with my eyes wide open to everything you are." Raphael, who had once gone 23 years without crying, did not manage to make it through his own vows without his voice breaking. "Your father saved my life once in a fire and asked for nothing. I spent years searching for a way to repay a debt I thought I owed a stranger. I understand now that I was never repaying a debt at all. I was looking for you. Josephine Hale, you walked into the coldest house in this city and made every room in it warm. You are not baggage. You were never baggage. You are the reason I finally understand what my father lost that made him soft enough to die for it, and I would let the whole world take everything else I own, gladly, 100 times over, as long as it left me you and Sam. Sam, standing between them with the ring pillow, tugged on Raphael's sleeve at exactly the wrong, exactly perfect moment. "Are you my dad now?" Raphael crouched down to the boy's level, the same way he had that very first cold night on the front steps, and said, in a voice thick with everything he'd spent 23 years refusing to feel, "If you'll have me." Sam threw both arms around his neck, ring pillow and all, and the entire garden dissolved into laughter and tears in equal measure. And somewhere above them, the same kind of snow that had once brought a desperate, dignified woman to a stranger's front gate began, gently, to fall again. Not cold this time, not frightening, just soft, quiet proof that sometimes the coldest nights are only the beginning of the warmest stories. She had come to his house with nowhere left to go. She left it with everywhere to be.